He had everything, except someone to ask him how his day went. Charles Stone was a millionaire, a man of power, precision, and polished routines. But behind the tailored suits and closed office doors was silence, the kind that echoed at night when no one was around to hear it. Then, one morning, an elevator stalled, trapped inside with his longtime secretary, Emily, a woman who had quietly admired him and quietly suffered under his cold indifference. What began as a mechanical failure turned into a moment of truth. What would you say if you had just a few minutes in a steel box with the person who never really saw you? Would you stay silent or finally speak your truth? This is a story about words unspoken, letters unsent, and two hearts that almost missed each other, until one elevator paused just long enough to change everything. If you've ever loved quietly, hurt silently, or wondered if it's too late to begin again, this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment if it touched you, and share this with someone who believes in second chances. Now, let us take you back to the day. The elevator stopped. He was a man of routine, controlled, calculated, emotionally sealed. Charles Stone arrived at the office each morning at precisely 7:10 a.m., his black Lincoln idling at the curb just long enough for the doorman to open the door. He nodded politely, never too warm, never too distant, always composed, always 3 steps ahead. The polished lobby of Stonewood Capital, nestled inside an aging red brick building in downtown Charleston, echoed his footsteps like a silent partner in his rituals. He didn't notice the faded Art Deco tiles beneath his leather shoes, nor the creak in the century-old elevator shaft. He didn't need to. He wasn't the kind of man who paid attention to the things that didn't make money. At 44, Charles Stone had built one of the largest lumber and sustainable wood manufacturing empires in the Southeast. He'd done it quietly, relentlessly, and with a sort of precision that made investors trust him, even if no one ever claimed to know him. His name appeared in trade journals and Forbes lists, but never in the society pages. He didn't date, he didn't dine, he didn't dream, and if he was lonely, well, he never said so. Emily Hart arrived at 7:01, as she had every weekday for the past 5 years. She was always early, always prepared, always invisible in the way a perfect assistant should be. At 36, she had a softness to her warm hazel eyes, hair the color of wheat in the sun, and a quiet way of carrying herself that suggested she'd lived a few lives before this one. She didn't wear flashy clothes or loud perfume. She carried a leather-bound planner, not a tablet. She preferred handwritten notes to emails, and she never spoke more than was necessary, at least. Not to Charles. They had shared the elevator nearly every morning for those 5 years. A silent ritual. Floor 1 to floor 9. No small talk. Sometimes a nod. Occasionally a brief morning. But mostly, it was silence the heavy, corporate kind. Emily never expected more. She wasn't the kind of woman men like Charles noticed, not beyond her efficiency, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man who invited closeness. But this morning, something shifted. It started with a tremor, a faint jolt as the elevator groaned between floors. Then came the grinding halt, the flicker of lights, and the unmistakable sound of stuck. Charles reached instinctively for the panel, pressed the emergency button, and exhaled controlled but clearly irritated. "Power surge," he muttered. "Old system." Emily looked up from her planner. "Looks like we'll be here a minute." He didn't reply. Silence returned, thicker than before. The small space suddenly felt smaller, as if the air itself had remembered it was old and tired. The soft hum of city traffic beyond the walls became a distant murmur. Time stretched. Then Charles sighed. Not dramatically, just defeated. Almost. "I have a call at 8. Emily nodded. "Of course you do." That's when something inside her snapped, not loudly, but firmly, a quiet fracture. "Of course you do," she repeated, more to herself than to him. "Because nothing ever gets in the way of your calls. Not traffic, not people, Not even 5 years of showing up early and staying late. Charles turned slowly, the movement subtle but sharp. "Excuse me." Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight in her words did all the lifting. "I've worked for you for 5 years, Mr. Stone. 5 years of birthdays missed, lunches skipped, nights spent rewriting reports because you changed your mind last minute without a single thank you that wasn't typed in a mass email." Charles stared at her as if she had just started speaking a foreign language. He looked disoriented, human. And you know what she continued, hands still calmly holding her planner. "That was fine. I didn't need gratitude. I just needed to feel like I wasn't furniture in your well-oiled machine." The elevator didn't move, but everything else inside it did. Charles had been called many things in his life: brilliant, exacting, ruthless, but never unaware. That was his pride. He noticed everything, but not this, not her. He blinked once. "I didn't realize, no," Emily said, gently but firmly. "You didn't. And maybe that's the problem." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the lights above them and the soft tap of Emily's thumb against the spine of her planner. Her face was calm, but her eyes, there was a storm there. Not the kind that raged, the kind that quietly reshaped the coastline. Charles looked down at his hands, those same hands that once carved wood in his father's workshop before ambition had replaced passion. They rested now against seams of a suit that cost more than Emily's monthly rent. He realized he had no idea what her rent was. He also realized he hadn't asked. "I'm sorry," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. Emily's expression softened just a flicker, but she didn't respond. Then her phone buzzed in her purse. She reached for it, tapped the screen, frowned, no signal. Charles checked his as well. Same. The elevator lights dimmed slightly, then flickered back. "Guess we're here for a while," Emily murmured. He nodded, then perhaps for the first time in 5 years, really looked at her. And she did the same. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do, no distractions, just a man and a woman, a boss and an assistant, trapped in a box suspended between floors, suspended between everything they thought they knew about each other. And for the first time in 5 years, they had no choice but to talk. She never planned to speak that way to her boss, but sometimes silence becomes too loud to bear. Emily Hart hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The words she'd spoken in that stuck elevator, quiet, deliberate, had been heavy enough to hang in the air like dust floating through sunbeams. And Charles Stone, the man who prided himself on unshakable composure, had been shaken. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was something older than anger, something that had built up grain by grain, like sawdust under a carpenter's boots, barely noticeable until it covered the whole floor. Now they stood in the stillness, both of them leaning slightly against opposite walls of the elevator, the small space impossibly quiet. The hum of fluorescent lighting, the occasional mechanical groan above these were the only sounds keeping them from being swallowed by the silence. Charles cleared his throat. "I didn't know." Emily looked up. "Didn't know what?" He hesitated. "That you felt that way." Her eyebrows rose, gently. "Of course you didn't. You don't ask. It wasn't an accusation. It was just true." Charles had built his life on managing data. People, projections. Feelings were unpredictable, messy. He had learned long ago that they were best kept at arm's length, like live wires. But something about Emily's words about the stillness they now occupied made him realize how much he had missed by keeping everything so far away. I assumed you were fine," he said. Emily gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "Not cruel, just weary. I know. You assume a lot. About everyone." Charles looked down at his hands again. They were strong hands, capable. But, in that moment, they looked like hands that didn't know how to hold anything gently. She spoke again, quieter now. "I used to admire you." That caught him off guard more than the earlier confrontation. She didn't elaborate right away. She let the words sit for a moment, breathing their own truth. I did, she continued. When I first started here, you were focused, driven. You came from nothing. I thought, this is a man who built something real, something lasting. Charles turned slightly toward her, but didn't interrupt. I thought that mattered, she said, that the kind of man who knew the grain of wood and the smell of sawdust could also see the people who worked beside him. Charles flinched inwardly. He knew the feeling of walnut dust clinging to your shirt, of shaping raw planks into something that would outlive you. But it had been years, decades, even. The man she thought she saw had disappeared somewhere along the way. What changed? He asked softly. Emily shrugged, arms crossed loosely in front of her. You did. Or maybe you didn't change at all. Maybe I just stopped expecting anything human from you. The words weren't meant to wound. But they landed with a quiet finality that made his chest tighten. She looked down at her shoes for a moment. My mother has congestive heart failure, she said suddenly, as if it had just slipped out. Charles blinked. I didn't know. No, she said gently. You didn't. He wasn't sure what to say. Emily didn't offer more, just stood there, the weight of the admission hanging between them, and for the first time, Charles wondered how many other things he'd missed. Not because they were hidden, but because he had never looked. I'm sorry, he said again, and this time he meant it more deeply. Emily nodded, just once. She's stable, for now. But it's been a rough year. Charles looked at her differently then, not as the woman who managed his schedule with flawless efficiency, but as a daughter, a caretaker, a person trying to carry far too much while still showing up every morning at 7. He felt small. I lost my father when I was 17, he said, almost surprising himself. Emily looked up, quietly waiting. He was a woodworker, had a shop behind our house, taught me how to cut dovetail joints before I ever learned to drive. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, grief, maybe, or memory. He used to say that every piece of wood has a voice. Charles continued, that if you listened close enough, you'd hear what it wanted to become. Emily's gaze softened. Did you ever listen? He nodded, then looked away. I used to. A long pause followed, the kind of pause that isn't awkward, just full. A pause that held years of things unsaid on both sides. The elevator gave a faint lurch, then a soft chime. The lights brightened slightly as the motor hummed back to life. They both looked up instinctively. Charles exhaled. Looks like we're moving again. The numbers on the panel above began to light up, slowly, one floor at a time. They didn't speak as the elevator resumed its climb, but something between them had already shifted. The space wasn't as heavy now. The silence no longer felt like armor. It felt necessary. When the doors finally opened at the 9th floor, neither of them moved right away. Emily stepped out first, but not without a glance back. Charles followed, slower than usual. They walked together down the corridor, not side by side, but not as far apart as before. What do you see when you look at a man like him? A suit, a title, or something far more broken beneath. It had been a week since the elevator incident, though calling it an incident seemed too clinical, too small for what had quietly unfolded between two people trapped, not just between floors, but between years of silence and one long overdue conversation. Charles Stone had resumed his usual routine, the polished shoes, the tailored suits, the quiet nods in the hallway. But something in his rhythm had softened, subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Yet, to Emily Hart, who had studied him from the edge of every meeting and memo for 5 years, the shift felt seismic. He paused more, looked up from his screen when she entered, asked questions, simple ones, like, how's your mother today, or did you get any sleep last night, that felt jarring coming from a man who had once barely glanced up to say thank you. At first, Emily had thought it was guilt, that maybe the conversation in the elevator had embarrassed him, and this was some awkward attempt at damage control. But it continued, day after day, without pretense, without effort, even. And what puzzled her most was that he wasn't trying to charm her. He wasn't trying at all. That morning, she found a paper coffee cup on her desk plain, from the cafe across the street. No note, no fanfare. Just the words, half cream. No sugar scribbled in a handwriting she recognized from boardroom whiteboards. She stared at it for a moment, unsure whether to be touched or wary. Maybe both. Charles didn't mention it when she entered his office later that morning with the weekly schedule. He was seated at his desk, reviewing a file, but not with his usual intensity. His gaze lingered over the pages like someone reading an old letter. "Anything you need changed?" she asked. He looked up. "No." "This is good." Emily nodded and turned to leave, but something on the corner of his desk caught her eye. It was a worn manila folder, not part of the day's agenda, and it was partially open, just enough to reveal a set of architectural sketches, thick lines, annotations in pencil, and there, in one corner, the words Stonewood Workshop, Community Arts Project. She paused. "You building something?" she asked, carefully. Charles followed her gaze, then hesitated. He reached for the folder but didn't close it. "It's a personal project," he said slowly. "Or it was..." Emily waited. "I bought a property outside town a few years ago," he continued, eyes still on the drawings. "An old warehouse. I had this idea to turn it into a woodworking center, a place for students, veterans, people in recovery, anyone who needed something to work with their hands." Emily's expression softened. "That's unexpected." Charles smiled faintly. "That's why I never showed it to anyone." He finally looked up. "I shelved it. Too busy, too many things to manage, maybe too afraid I'd forgotten how to care about something that didn't make money." Emily took a cautious step forward. "Why tell me now?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her like someone seeing something for the first time. "Because," he said quietly, "you reminded me that not everything worth building has to be efficient or perfect." The words hung in the air like sawdust after a long day's work. Emily wasn't sure how to respond. A part of her felt honored, another part guarded. It was rare for Charles to open any door not directly connected to a conference room. Then he surprised her again. "I'm going out there this weekend," he said, "to the property, to see if it's still worth doing." She raised an eyebrow. "Still worth it?" Charles tilted his head. "Things change. Priorities shift. But sometimes, something old becomes necessary again." He paused, then added, "Would you come with me?" The question landed between them like a soft knock on a door she hadn't realized was there. Emily hesitated, not out of fear, exactly, but because invitations from men like Charles usually came with expectations, subtext, implications, but this wasn't that. His voice carried none of the entitlement she had seen in other men of his position. No ulterior tone, just quiet sincerity. Still, she needed a moment. "I don't know," she said truthfully. "It's not really part of my job description." Charles nodded. "It doesn't have to be." Silence returned, but it was no longer a wall. It was a waiting place. Emily looked again at the sketches, the faint pencil markings, the careful measurements in the margins. This wasn't a presentation for investors. It was something else. Something closer to hope. She exhaled slowly. "Okay, I'll go." His eyes met hers, and for once, they weren't guarded. "Saturday?" he asked. She nodded. As she left the office, planner tucked under her arm. She didn't look back, but her thoughts were no longer entirely focused on meetings or logistics. Something was shifting, and though she couldn't yet name it, she could feel it in her bones like the first warm breeze that hinted spring was coming. She knew the signs. When life gets good, something always goes wrong. It's safer to step away first. The road to the old warehouse curved gently through the outskirts of Charleston, where city sounds faded into the hush of tall grass and rusted fences. It was Saturday morning, the sky a soft quilt of early autumn clouds, and the air carried that rare in-between chill, the kind that made you wonder whether to bring a jacket or simply keep your arms folded. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat of Charles's truck, a surprising choice of vehicle for a man so polished. It wasn't the sleek black Lincoln that usually waited for him at the curb. This was older, more worn. The leather cracked, the radio silent. It smelled faintly of cedar and oil. She glanced at him briefly as he drove. He looked comfortable, like he belonged behind that wheel in a way she hadn't seen him belong behind any boardroom table. They didn't talk much during the drive. Charles wasn't avoiding words. He just didn't force them. Emily appreciated that. It gave her space to breathe, to think, and to feel the slow creep of something unfamiliar hope. That scared her more than she wanted to admit. When they reached the property, Charles unlocked the rusted gate and drove up a gravel path lined with pine trees. The building itself stood at the edge of a clearing, an old brick structure with high windows. Ivy climbing up one side, and faded paint where the company name of a forgotten past had once been proudly displayed. It used to be a train parts warehouse, he said as they stepped out. Closed in the 70s. Emily nodded, pulling her sweater tighter as a breeze stirred the golden leaves beneath their feet. Inside, the space was dusty but filled with light. Wooden beams crossed overhead like ribs, and the smell of old timber settled into her skin. In one corner, someone, maybe Charles himself, had stacked unused lumber, sheets of sandpaper, and a few lonely tools. She could see it, could imagine what it might become, and that, too, frightened her. They walked slowly through the space, their footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. Charles stopped by one of the windows, brushing his hand across the sill. "My mom used to make me wipe down windows like this every Saturday," he said with a half smile. Didn't matter if they were clean. She said it taught discipline. Emily leaned against the frame beside him. "She sounds like someone I would have liked. She died when I was 12. His voice remained steady, but his gaze drifted somewhere far away. "Heart condition, sudden. My dad never really came back from that. Not emotionally. She didn't speak, just listened. I started helping him in the shop after school." He continued, "Not because I wanted to, but because he needed someone there. I think the sound of the saws was the only thing that kept him from falling apart." Emily looked at him, and for a moment saw the boy he had been too young for loss, too old to be comforted. "That's when I learned how to build," he added, "not just with wood, with walls." The admission hung in the dusty air between them. She didn't reach for him, but she didn't look away either. They spent another hour walking the space, talking about layouts, possibilities, and what it would take to turn the dream into something real. Charles asked her opinion more than once, and she offered it not just professionally, but as someone who could see beyond blueprints. Still, the more she saw, the more something inside her tightened. She was no stranger to leaving before things broke. After all, her life had been a patchwork of caretaking and sacrifice. Nothing good ever stayed. And this felt too good, too gentle, too honest. It scared her in a way that scraped against old wounds. By the time they drove back into Charleston, the sky had dimmed to a soft gray. Emily sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, heart aching with a mix of things she didn't want to name. She thanked him when he dropped her off, smiled politely, and as she stepped inside her apartment, she didn't cry, she didn't unravel. She simply opened her laptop and began typing. The email was short, professional, precise, effective immediately. "I will be resigning from my position as executive assistant to Mr. Charles Stone. Please consider this my formal notice." No further explanation was given. No forwarding address. She didn't even sign it. Best, just her name. Emily Hart. She hit send, then turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, arms folded tightly around herself, as if holding the pieces together would make the choice easier. Charles saw the email at 10:37 p.m. He didn't move right away, just stared at the screen, reading it once, then again, and again, as if reading it enough times would somehow change the words. But it didn't. She was gone. He didn't call, didn't reply. Instead, he stood, walked to the coat rack, and grabbed the wool jacket he hadn't worn in months. He stepped into the quiet hallway of his office building, turned off the lights one by one, and walked toward the elevator. This time, it worked perfectly. Smooth, efficient, silent. He rode it down alone, and when he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city already sleeping around him, he realized the strangest thing. For the first time in years, he had no idea what to do next. He built empires with words and contracts. But when it came to her, silence was the only thing he had left. There were moments in a man's life when silence was a luxury. Charles Stone used to seek it like a prize early mornings before the office stirred, late nights when the city thinned out, and all that remained was the hush of success humming in his ears. Silence meant control. It meant peace. But ever since she left, silence had become something else entirely. Not peace, not control, just absence. His office returned to its pristine order. His days returned to form. Schedules ran smoothly. Calls were answered, files delivered on time. The new assistant was efficient, punctual, polite, and completely invisible. Not because she lacked competence, on the contrary, she was sharp. But Charles didn't look up anymore. He didn't ask how anyone was doing, didn't offer coffee, didn't speak beyond what was absolutely necessary. He had stepped back into his shell and pulled the world in behind him, miles away, in a quieter town where oak trees lined the sidewalks and folks still waved from porches. Emily Hart moved more slowly these days. Her mother, Mrs. Hart, had good days and tired days. Emily stayed close on both. The little brick house they shared smelled of chamomile tea, folded laundry, and old books. Books were everywhere now. Emily had taken a part-time job at the town library, not because she needed the money, though it helped, but because she needed something quiet to hold on to. Something that wouldn't ask too many questions or require her to explain why she now flinched at kindness. In the mornings, she shelved novels. In the afternoons, she read to the children's group, though her voice sometimes caught when a story ended too hopefully. She didn't speak about Charleston, or Stonewood, or Charles, not to her mother, not to herself. But at night sometimes she opened the drawer by her bed and looked at the envelope. Cream-colored, no return address, just her name, Emily Hart, written in pen, his handwriting, slanted, measured. It had arrived 3 days after she left. The neighbor boy had knocked gently on the front door, handed it to her, and said, "A man in a gray coat told me to give you this." That was all. She hadn't opened it, not yet. Not because she didn't want to know what was inside, but because once she did, there would be no going back to the quiet safety of pretending it didn't exist. So she kept it, unopened, untouched. But never out of reach. Back in Charleston. Charles sat at his desk, past midnight. Again. The office was dark except for the glow of the desk lamp and the dim city lights filtering through the window. His fingers hovered above the keyboard of his laptop, but no emails came, no thoughts worth typing. On the edge of the desk sat a stack of papers that weren't urgent. They hadn't been urgent in days, maybe weeks, but they gave him something to move, to adjust, to pretend he still had traction in the world. He glanced at the small notebook beside them, the one where he used to jot down random thoughts, ideas, scraps of possibility. It had a single page folded over, the page he had written the letter on. He had planned to give it to her in person, to explain, not to beg her to return, he had too much pride for that, but to tell her something honest. Finally, that he noticed now, that he saw her, that he missed her, not just her presence, but her patience, her clarity, the way she grounded the spinning plates of his life without asking for credit. He had stood outside her apartment for 15 minutes before slipping the envelope into the hand of a passing boy with a promise. Please make sure she gets this. He never knew if she did, but the silence that followed told him everything. Or so he thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Jake Brennan appeared in his office unannounced. Charles barely looked up. "I'm not in the mood." Jake ignored the warning tone. He walked to the window, whistled low, and said, "Same view, same you. But you look like you haven't slept since college." Charles didn't reply. Jake turned, hands in pockets. "You still thinking about her?" Charles closed his laptop. Jake took that as a yes. "I ran into someone last weekend," he said, "a teacher at a small town library. She mentioned a new part-timer with soft eyes and a quiet voice who reads to kids like she's telling them secrets that matter." Charles stilled. Jake stepped closer, lowered his voice. "She's upstate, small town, good coffee shop, I hear, great place to disappear." Charles didn't ask how Jake knew. Jake had always known things before others did. "I don't think she wants to be found," Charles said finally. Jake shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe she's waiting for someone to prove she's not, just someone people forget when things get hard." The words landed like a stone in water rippling outward, disturbing the surface. Charles stood slowly, walked to the window. He could see the top of the elevator shaft from here. Funny, he thought, how something that confined could still change the direction of a life. Jake's voice came softer now. "So, I'll ask just once. Do you want to find her?" Charles didn't turn around. He didn't need to. Because deep inside, beneath the layers of routine and distance and damage, he already knew the answer. He didn't know how to say it out loud. So, he let books speak for him. The mornings in Hartfield were quiet in a way that Charleston never could be. Emily Hart had come to love that stillness, the soft patter of dew on the library windows, the slow creak of shelves settling, the scent of paper and old wood. There were no meetings, no emails arriving in rapid succession, just the peaceful rhythm of people coming in search of stories that weren't their own. But this morning, something broke the quiet. A delivery truck pulled up just after 8 hours. Emily watched through the frosted front door as a man in a blue jacket unloaded a single box. Not a pallet, not a stack, just one box. Square, sturdy. The kind used for something that mattered. She signed the clipboard, thanked the driver, and wheeled the package inside on a dolly. It wasn't heavy, but it had that unmistakable weight of meaning, the kind of presence that made you hesitate before opening. The label read simply, "To Hartfield Public Library, ATTN Donations Desk. No return address. No name." Emily stared at it a long moment before reaching for the scissors in the supply drawer. She carefully sliced through the tape, folded back the cardboard flaps, and paused. Books. Not just any books. These were special, leather-bound, cloth-wrapped, some with gilded edges. A first edition Wuthering Heights, a vintage Hemingway with margin notes, a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, so lovingly preserved it looked untouched. Each was wrapped in parchment paper, the kind you'd use for something precious. Not a single spine cracked, no dog-eared pages. Whoever had chosen these hadn't done it lightly. Then she saw it, tucked neatly between a copy of Leaves of Grass and a rare edition of The Old Man and the Sea, was something unexpected to note. Not in an envelope, just folded paper, cream-colored, thick, and on the outside, in handwriting she hadn't seen in months, Emily. No last name, no title, just her. She stood still for a moment, the air thick with recognition. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the note. The words inside were simple, handwritten, careful, as though the writer had rewritten them a dozen times in his head before ever putting pen to paper. "Emily, I used to think silence was strength, that if I said less, felt less, needed less, I'd be harder to break. But the truth is, silence broke me a long time ago. I just didn't notice until you spoke inside that elevator, and everything I'd buried cracked open. Since the day you left, I've thought about what I should have said, every night, every morning, and still, the words never came the way I wanted. So, instead, I've sent you this. Books have always spoken for me better than I speak for myself. These are the ones that kept me warm in winters too long, and grounded in seasons when I was drifting, maybe among these pages, you'll find something that says what I couldn't, or maybe you'll know it's me saying it, in the only way I know how. See, Emily read it once, then again, and again. The third time, her hands were no longer steady. A single tear fell onto the edge of the note, smudging a part of his signature, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it mark the page, like proof that it had reached her heart. It was unmistakably Charles, the clipped rhythm of his thoughts, the restraint that still softened at the edges, the unspoken weight behind every carefully chosen line. And suddenly, months of silence collapsed into sound, the memory of his voice in the elevator, the look in his eyes when he had asked her to come see the workshop, the man she had seen behind the title, the man who had stayed hidden so long that even he had forgotten who he was. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, note in hand, surrounded by unopened books and 1,000 opened emotions. The world outside the library windows moved on, cars passing, leaves rustling, someone laughing across the street, but inside her, everything stood still. Finally. She set the note down gently on the circulation desk. With both hands, she lifted leaves of grass and turned to the page where the letter had been placed. Page 142. I am large, I contain multitudes. It made her breath hitch. She closed the book with reverence, placed it on the stack, and reached into her apron pocket for her phone. Her contact list hadn't changed. She hadn't deleted his number. Charles Stone. Still there? Still untouched. She stared at the screen, thumb hovering over his name. Her heart pounded in her chest like it had the day she left without goodbye. She'd run then out of fear, out of pride, out of something she couldn't name. But now, that fear felt smaller than the ache. She whispered to herself, "Don't be a coward," and her thumb pressed the call button. If he didn't care, why did his voice still shake when he heard mine? The call connected on the second ring. For a heartbeat, Emily thought it might go to voicemail, that maybe he'd changed his number, that maybe, despite everything, he wouldn't answer. But then, there it was, a breath. Then his voice. Emily. She didn't speak right away. She couldn't. Hearing her name and his voice low, cautious, familiar, felt like finding something she didn't realize she'd lost. Yes, she managed, softly. It's me. Silence stretched between them, not cold, not awkward, just full, as if neither wanted to say the wrong thing, as if every word might tilt the fragile balance they'd just rediscovered. Charles was the first to speak again. I didn't think I'd hear from you. I wasn't sure I'd call, Emily admitted. I wasn't sure what I'd say. That makes two of us. A small smile tugged at her lips. Unexpected. Even through the phone. He sounded like himself, slightly formal, slightly guarded, but unmistakably Charles. There was something comforting in that. They didn't apologize. Not directly. No one said, "I'm sorry for leaving." No one said, "I missed you." Instead, Charles asked, "How's your mother?" Emily's throat tightened. Stable. We've had some better days lately. I'm glad, he said, and she knew he meant it. A pause. And you? She asked. How have you been? Charles let out a quiet breath, the kind that carries more truth than words. Still working too much, still drinking bad office coffee, still avoiding the break room when they bring donuts. I don't like... That made her laugh, an easy, warm sound that surprised them both. Sounds familiar, she said. His voice softened. And you? Still organizing books by color, like some sort of rebel librarian. I'm expanding into seasonal themes now, she teased. Autumn tones in the front display? Radical. There it was, the rhythm, the quiet ease that had once settled between them during long work days, during quiet elevator rides, during brief glances that lasted longer than they should have. Charles cleared his throat gently. Emily, she held her breath. I never expected you to reply. Not after I wasn't ready. She cut in, gently. I think you knew that. I hoped someday you would be, he said. There was a vulnerability in his tone that she hadn't heard before, a carefulness that told her just how much this call meant. She nodded, forgetting he couldn't see. I read your letter. In the book. I wasn't sure you'd open it. I almost didn't, she whispered. But then I remembered, you don't send leaves of grass to someone you've forgotten? Charles chuckled, but it cracked midway. You were always better at knowing what things meant. No, she said. I just started listening better. Another pause. Emily's voice softened. You mentioned the workshop in your letter. Is it still just on paper? Charles was quiet for a beat. Then, yes. I drive out to the lot sometimes. Just sit in the truck. Haven't started building. Haven't touched the plans since you left. Her heart clenched. Why I think I was waiting, he said, but I didn't know for what. The line went quiet again, not out of discomfort, but because there was too much to feel at once. Then Emily said something that made him still. I haven't cleared out my desk yet. His breath caught. I told the library I'd work part-time. She continued, told them it was temporary, and I meant it. I just didn't know what I was waiting for either. Charles swallowed hard. Emily. She smiled through a sting behind her eyes. I guess I never really left. Charles. Not completely. It was his turn to be silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Would you come see the land again? Not as my assistant. Not for work, then for what she asked gently. For you, for us, to see if something's still there. Emily closed her eyes. Her pulse was a soft echo in her ears. When she asked, Saturday, he replied, quickly, the weather's supposed to be clear. I'll bring coffee, none of the bitter office kind. She smiled. Bring 2 sugars this time, not 3. He laughed. You noticed. I always noticed. Another long silence, but this one felt like sunlight through a window. Quiet, warm, hopeful. Charles spoke one last time before the call ended. Emily, thank you for calling. She answered with words he'd never heard from her before. Words that could have been a whisper, a promise, or a beginning. I missed hearing your voice. She hung up before she could say more, but he didn't need more. He sat there, alone in his office, holding the silent phone against his chest. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope. It wasn't just wood and dust. It was the place where 2 broken people started building again. The morning sky over Charleston was brushed in soft grays and warm golds, like a watercolor painting left to dry in the sun. Emily pulled into the gravel driveway slowly, her tires crunching over the uneven stones. The workshop stood at the edge of a quiet field, still wrapped in scaffolding, surrounded by lumber, coils of extension cords, and the low hum of cicadas in the distance. It wasn't finished, but it had begun. She stepped out of the car and inhaled, the scent of fresh pine and sawdust mixed with dew-covered grass. It was a scent that reached beyond her senses, into something older, something rooted in memory, in beginnings, in possibilities. Charles was already there, crouched by a workbench, sanding down a thick plank of walnut. He looked up as she approached, and for the briefest second, he smiled like a man surprised to see sunlight. You came, he said simply, setting down the sander. I said I would, Emily replied, brushing hair from her face. You brought coffee. 2 sugars, no more, he said, handing her a cup. I listen sometimes. She took the coffee and held his gaze. Sometimes is better than never. He led her through the wide doorway, past skeletal beams and half-finished walls. The air inside was cooler, quiet, with a faint echo like a space waiting for stories to be told. There were no office chairs, no marble floors, no fluorescent lights, just wood and promise and dust that clung like history. They didn't speak much. There was no need to. Charles showed her the corner where he planned to place an open reading space, and she nodded. She helped him organize the chisels and hand planes, wiping them down one by one. Together, They tested wood stains against the grain of different planks, debating between warm oak and deep mahogany like two old souls deciding on poetry versus prose. At one point, Emily accidentally knocked over a bucket of nails, and they scattered like silver rain across the floor. She bent down, flustered, but Charles just laughed a sound so unguarded, so deeply human, that she paused. "You always did take everything too seriously," he said gently. Emily looked up at him, kneeling on the sawdust-covered floor, fingers full of tiny nails, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to laugh too. They worked side by side until afternoon. Light poured in through the high window panes, catching particles in the air like glitter in slow motion. Sweat clung to the back of their necks, and wood shavings covered their shoes. There was something healing in it, not because it was romantic or cinematic, but because it was real, because they were no longer hiding behind titles, routines, or unspoken things. Later, Charles walked over to a low bench tucked into the back of the workshop. He picked up something wrapped in an old cloth and brought it to her. "I made this a while ago," he said. "Didn't know if I'd ever get to give it to you." He unwrapped the cloth and revealed a smooth piece of cherry wood, small enough to fit in two hands. Her name was carved into it, Emily, in careful, deliberate strokes. Below the name was a simple engraving. "Still here?" Her breath caught. She ran her fingers over the carving, tracing the letters slowly, as if memorizing the feel of them. "You did this by hand?" she asked. He nodded. "It's not perfect, but neither am I." She didn't say anything right away. Her voice wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out and hugged the block of wood to her chest, like something sacred, something earned. "I'll keep it," she whispered, "even if I walk away again." Charles's voice was quiet, steady. "You won't have to." As the sun began to dip lower, they sat on a low ledge near the wide window at the back of the workshop. The light slanted in, golden and soft, warming the bare wood beneath them. Outside, birds flitted through tall grass, and the world felt momentarily paused like it was waiting, too. Charles leaned back, resting his palms behind him, gaze fixed on the beams above. "I used to come here," he said, "before there was anything, just dirt and weeds. I'd stand in the middle and try to imagine what it could be, but I could never picture it with anyone in it. It was always empty." Emily turned to look at him, her voice low, and now Charles didn't move for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and in that look was something stripped bare, no defenses, no walls, just the man he had always tried to hide. "I don't feel alone here anymore." She said nothing, just reached over, quietly, and placed her hand over his. They sat that way until the light faded, not speaking, not needing to. And in the stillness, the air filled with the kind of silence that heals instead of haunts. You never realize the moment healing begins, until one day, it's just quiet. The weeks that followed were not marked by declarations or sudden changes, but by a rhythm that settled into their days like the tide, gentle, steady, and quietly faithful. Emily returned to Charleston in early spring, not with dramatic luggage or fanfare, but with a worn canvas bag, 2 boxes of books, and her mother riding in the passenger seat beside her. Mrs. Hart, though tired, had more color in her cheeks than she had in months. The sea air, Emily hoped, would do them both some good. Charles had offered them the small guest house tucked behind his old Victorian near the harbor, a space he rarely used. Emily accepted, but only on the condition she paid rent. He didn't argue, though he never cashed the first check she left on the counter. Some things were better unspoken. Back at the workshop, the walls now stood tall, beams sanded and stained to a deep amber warmth. Large windows welcomed morning light like an old friend. The place had transformed into more than a building. It was becoming a gathering ground for quiet hopes and second chances. They called it the Hearth. It wasn't an art gallery. It wasn't a school. It was a little bit of both, and something more where people could come to create or to watch others do so. Children, retirees, veterans, teachers, anyone who carried a story they weren't sure how to tell with words. And Charles. Well, he was just Charles now. He wore plaid shirts instead of tailored suits. Sawdust lived under his fingernails more often than not. The phone on his belt didn't buzz with mergers or deadlines anymore. He still worked because it was in his blood, but his hours weren't stolen from him now. They were chosen. Sometimes Emily would walk past the open studio door and see him standing in the middle of the room, watching someone sketch or carve or paint, and she'd catch the faintest softness in his eyes. He didn't need to say it aloud, but she knew. This was the life he'd wanted before he forgot he could want anything at all. On a warm Saturday morning, a group of local kids came in for their first watercolor session. Their small voices filled the space like birdsong, nervous at first, then louder as paintbrushes found courage. Emily sat with a little girl named Ruby, who had brought her own watercolors in a metal tin with a broken hinge. She painted quickly, in big, joyful strokes, trees too blue, skies too red, but every image bursting with sincerity. Charles passed by, offering extra paper, checking on drying racks, smiling faintly when the children weren't looking. Ruby watched him, eyes squinting with curiosity. After a moment, she whispered to Emily, "Is he the boss?" Emily smiled. Something like that? Ruby didn't respond. She went back to painting, tongue peeking out in concentration. A few minutes later, she tiptoed across the room to Charles and held out her page. "This is for you," she said shyly. "It's you." He blinked, surprised, then leaned down to take the paper. The figure on the page was stick-legged and round-headed, wearing a flannel shirt and surrounded by yellow beams of light. Written in pink crayon at the top, Mr. Charles, the man who smiles. Sometimes. He stared at it. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched. A soft sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh escaped from deep in his chest. His shoulders, often so square and tight, dropped slightly. He laughed. It was small, unpolished, and maybe a little unsure. But it was real. Emily, who had been watching from the other side of the room, felt something inside her chest loosen. Something she hadn't even realized was still clenched. The laughter rippled through her, not loud, not showy, but like warm tea in cold hands. Later, when the children had left and the sun was dipping lower in the sky, she found him standing near the window, holding Ruby's painting like a treasure. He didn't notice her approach, not at first. She didn't say anything, just stepped beside him quietly, her presence familiar now, like a porch light left on, like something worth coming home to. Then, gently, she placed her hand on his shoulder, not to comfort, not to ask, just to say, "I'm here." Charles didn't look back, but he lifted his hand and placed it over hers, fingers wrapping around with a quiet certainty that said everything words could not. Outside, the light shifted, catching the edges of the wooden beams and making them glow. Inside, no music played, no speeches were made, no grand revelations, just two people who had once been strangers in a broken elevator, now standing together in a space they had built not just from wood and nails, but from patience, forgiveness, and the brave act of staying. Healing had arrived, not loudly, not with trumpets, but like the soft click of a door unlocking from the inside. The elevator hadn't broken again, but this time, they chose to stay just a little longer. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Emily and Charles pulled up to the old Stonewood Capitol building. The parking lot looked the same, polished blacktop, assigned spaces, that familiar hedge that always needed trimming. It had been nearly a year since either of them had stepped foot inside. Charles shut off the engine, but didn't reach for the door handle right away. Instead, he looked across the dashboard at Emily, who was tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Strange being back," he murmured. Emily smiled faintly. "Feels smaller than I remember." They got out in comfortable silence. The lobby doors opened with a gentle whoosh, letting in the same crisp scent of lemon-scented floor wax and copy paper. Reception had a new face, young man in his 20s who looked up with curiosity, perhaps recognizing the man who used to own the place. Charles nodded politely, but didn't explain himself. They made their way to the elevator. It looked just as it had the day: brushed steel panels, soft yellow lighting, slightly too slow to close. Emily reached for the button, but Charles beat her to it. Their fingers brushed, neither moved away. The elevator chimed, the doors opened, they stepped in. This time, there was no awkward silence, no buzzing tension, no unspoken things clawing for release. Just two people standing side by side, closer than necessary, but not yet touching. Charles pressed the button for the 14th floor, his old office, the place where he once ruled behind glass walls and marble desks, and where she used to wait quietly with a folder in her hand and questions she never asked. The doors slid closed. The elevator began to rise. At first, there was nothing but the soft hum of machinery. No sudden jolt, no flashing lights, just smooth ascent. Charles slid his hands into his pockets. Emily clasped hers gently in front of her. Then, quietly, unexpectedly, they both began to laugh. It was soft at first, then warm, not loud, but real. The kind of laughter that comes when a memory no longer stings, but simply belongs to the past. "I can't believe it still smells the same," Emily said, between chuckles, like cheap carpet and expensive tension. Charles shook his head, amused. "That carpet cost more than my first house." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a different kind this time, full of knowing, of memory, of growth. The numbers blinked upward. 9, 10. "Do you regret it?" Charles asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The day the elevator stopped, Emily turned toward him. Her eyes were soft, but steady. "No," she said. "That elevator didn't break. It just paused long enough for us to find each other." He nodded, as if he'd been holding his breath waiting for that answer. The elevator dinged at 14. The doors opened slowly, revealing the corridor that once held glass offices, sharp shoes, whispered promotions, and 1,000 unspoken boundaries. They didn't step out. They stood in the doorway for a long moment. Charles looked out at the hallway, then back at Emily. "You know," he said softly, "I don't miss this." "Not even a little?" she asked. He smiled. "Maybe the coffee machine. But everything I thought mattered. It never quite held up to the day that elevator paused." Emily leaned slightly against the wall, watching him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we just stayed quiet that day?" Charles met her gaze. "I would have missed the best part of my life." The doors began to close again. He didn't stop them. They descended together, hand in hand this time. Not because something was broken, but because this time, neither of them was in a hurry to get back to the world. When the doors finally opened to the lobby, the young receptionist looked up again. Puzzled, Charles offered a smile and a small nod. Then they walked back out into the morning light, two people who had once been strangers in a stalled elevator, now bound by something neither of them had planned for, but both had chosen. Love, after all, didn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrived in the quiet pause between floors, and sometimes the elevator still worked, but you stayed anyway. Sometimes life pauses just long enough for us to hear the truth we've spent years avoiding. In this story, a broken elevator became more than a mechanical failure. It became a space where silence broke, hearts opened, and healing began. Charles, a man who built empires but forgot how to connect, finally listened. Emily, a woman who gave quietly for years, finally spoke. Their journey reminds us that even the strongest walls can soften, and that vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. As we grow older, it's easy to believe that change is for the young, or that certain things: love, forgiveness, second chances are behind us. But the truth is, it's never too late to pause, to speak, to reach out. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of honesty, one letter sent, one hand held. So, if there's someone you've held back from, if there's something your heart still longs to say, maybe today is the day you let the elevator pause. After all, Healing doesn't always announce itself, but when it comes, it's worth everything. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, the heart never retires. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs hope, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Your support helps us keep telling these gentle human stories, the kind that heal, connect, and remind us that it's never too late to begin again. We're so grateful to have you here. Until next time, take care of your heart